September 1942. The Pacific War was raging. Japan had stunned the world with its attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Imperial Navy was hungry for more psychological victories. But this time, the target wasn't a military base. It was something far more audacious, the American mainland. In a quiet naval base in Japan, a 31-year-old pilot named Nobuo Fujita was summoned for a top-secret briefing. He wasn't a kamikaze. He wasn't a bomber ace. He was a reconnaissance pilot, trained to fly small, stealthy aircraft launched from submarines. But the mission he was about to receive would make him the only enemy aviator in history to bomb the continental United States. Fujita listened as officers described the plan. He would board the I-25, a massive Japanese submarine equipped with a collapsible floatplane. The sub would travel across the Pacific, surface off the coast of Oregon, and launch Fujita inland. His goal? Drop incendiary bombs into the dense forests of America's Pacific Northwest, sparking wildfires and panic. The idea was psychological warfare. Japan knew it couldn't match America's industrial might, but if it could make Americans feel vulnerable, if it could show that even their homeland wasn't safe, it might shift morale. Fujita accepted the mission with quiet resolve. He packed his flight gear, studied maps of the Oregon coastline, and prepared his plane. But he also brought something deeply personal, a 400-year-old samurai sword passed down through generations of his family. He placed it in the cockpit beside him. If he died, he wanted to die with honor. The I-25 departed Japan in late August. The crew was tense but focused. They knew they were making history. As they approached the American coast, the submarine submerged during the day and surfaced at night. On September 9, they reached their launch point near Brookings, Oregon. The sea was calm, the sky was overcast. Fujita climbed into his tiny Yokosuka E-14Y Glenn floatplane, which had been assembled on deck. The plane was barely larger than a car, with a single engine and open cockpit. It was designed for stealth, not speed. As the crew launched him into the sky, Fujita looked down at the vast Pacific, then ahead toward the Oregon wilderness. He was alone, the only Japanese pilot ever to fly over the American mainland during wartime. He carried 2 incendiary bombs, each designed to ignite massive forest fires. Below him stretched miles of untouched wilderness. He flew inland for about 50 miles, scanning for a suitable drop zone. Then he released the bombs. They fell silently through the mist, disappearing into the trees below. Fujita turned his plane and flew back toward the coast, hoping the fires would spread. He landed safely on the submarine, which quickly submerged and vanished into the Pacific. The mission had lasted less than an hour, but it had made history. Back in Japan, Fujita was hailed as a hero, but he felt uneasy. He didn't know if the bombs had caused damage. He didn't know if anyone had died, and he couldn't shake the image of the quiet forests he had flown over, peaceful, untouched, and now possibly burning. He had done his duty, but something inside him had changed. The I-25 was unlike any submarine the world had seen. At over 350 feet long, it was a floating fortress, armed not just with torpedoes, but with something far more unusual: a hangar. Inside that hangar sat a disassembled aircraft, the Yokosuka E-14Y Glenn, a tiny floatplane designed for reconnaissance and surprise attacks. Japan's military engineers had created a marvel of stealth. The Glenn could be launched from the deck, fly hundreds of miles inland, and return to the sub, which would then vanish beneath the waves. It was the perfect tool for psychological warfare, and Nobuo Fujita was its chosen pilot. On September 9, 1942, the I-25 surfaced off the coast of Oregon, near the sleepy town of Brookings. The crew worked quickly, assembling the floatplane in the early morning mist. Every bolt, every wing strut had to be secured with precision. Time was critical. American patrols could appear at any moment. Fujita climbed into the cockpit. The plane was cramped, barely large enough for one man.
He carried 2 incendiary bombs, each weighing 76 kilograms, designed to ignite massive forest fires. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, not from heat, but from the weight of history pressing down on him. The Glen was launched by catapult, rising into the sky like a ghost. Fujita flew low, hugging the treetops to avoid detection. Below him stretched the vast wilderness of southern Oregon, endless forests, rugged terrain, and no sign of human life. He flew inland for nearly 50 miles, scanning for a suitable drop zone. The forest was dense, dry in places, and vulnerable. Fujita released the first bomb, then the second. He watched as they disappeared into the canopy, then turned back toward the coast. The entire mission lasted less than an hour, but it was unprecedented. Japan had just bombed the continental United States. Back on the submarine, the crew welcomed Fujita with quiet pride. They had made history. The I-25 submerged and slipped away, leaving no trace. But the bombs didn't behave as expected. The forest was damp from recent rain. The fires fizzled quickly. A lookout tower spotted smoke, and forest rangers responded swiftly. The damage was minimal. Still, the psychological impact was enormous. America had been attacked, not in Hawaii, but on its own soil. The FBI launched an investigation. Locals were stunned. Who would bomb Oregon? Fujita didn't know the outcome. He had no way of knowing whether the fires had spread or been contained. He had done his duty, but the mission haunted him. In Japan, the raid was kept quiet. The military didn't want to provoke further retaliation. Fujita returned to his base, his sword still intact, his conscience unsettled. The I-25 continued its patrol, later sinking 2 American ships off the California coast. But its most famous mission remained the Oregon bombing, a strange, surreal moment in the history of World War II. Years later, historians would debate its significance. Militarily, it was a failure. Psychologically, it was a shock. Symbolically, it was unforgettable. And for Nobuo Fujita, it was the beginning of a journey that would take decades to complete.
The bombs dropped silently through the misty Oregon sky. Nobuo Fujita watched from above as the incendiary devices vanished into the forest canopy. He had no way of knowing what would happen next. Would the fires rage out of control? Would towns be evacuated? Would lives be lost? Below, the Siskiyou National Forest stretched endlessly, a sea of green thick with pine and fir. It was early morning, and the forest was quiet. But within minutes, smoke began to rise. A fire lookout stationed in a remote tower spotted the plume. He radioed for help. Forest rangers mobilized quickly, driving through rugged terrain to reach the site. When they arrived, they found 2 small fires burning in the underbrush. The ground was damp from recent rain, and the flames were sluggish. Using shovels, water packs, and sheer determination, the rangers contained the fires before they could spread. No homes were threatened. No lives were lost. But something was off. The fires didn't look natural. Investigators found fragments of metal, bomb casings, scorched and twisted. The FBI was called in. They examined the site, collected evidence, and began piecing together the mystery. Who had bombed Oregon, and why? Meanwhile, Fujita had returned to the I-25. The submarine submerged and disappeared into the Pacific. The crew was silent. They didn't know if the mission had succeeded, but they had done something no one else had. They had bombed the American mainland. In Brookings, the nearest town, news of the fire spread slowly. The government kept the incident quiet, fearing panic, but rumors swirled. Some locals believed it was sabotage. Others thought it was a meteor. A few suspected something darker, an enemy attack. The truth was stranger than fiction. A Japanese pilot had flown over Oregon and dropped bombs. It was the first and only time in history that a foreign power had launched an aerial attack on the continental United States. The FBI's investigation confirmed it. The bomb fragments matched Japanese designs. The flight path was reconstructed. The I-25's presence off the coast was verified. America had been attacked. Not in Hawaii, not in Alaska, but in Oregon. The news was kept under wraps. President Roosevelt didn't want to alarm the public. The war was already stretching America's resources. Another panic could be disastrous. But in Brookings, the memory lingered. The forest had burned, the bombs had fallen, and the pilot had vanished. For Fujita, the mission was over. He had fulfilled his orders, but he couldn't forget the forest, the silence, the beauty, the vulnerability. He wondered if the fires had spread. He wondered if anyone had died. He wondered if he had made a difference. Back in Japan, the raid was barely mentioned. It was a footnote in a war filled with massive battles and devastating losses. But for Fujita, it was personal. He had flown alone. He had carried his family's sword. He had dropped bombs on a land he had never seen before. And he had returned with questions that would haunt him for decades.
Brookings, Oregon, was a quiet town nestled between forest and sea. In 1942, its population was just over 1,000. Loggers, fishermen, shopkeepers, and families living far from the front lines of World War II. The war felt distant. Pearl Harbor was thousands of miles away. Europe even farther. But that illusion shattered on a smoky September morning. When forest rangers reported the strange fires and bomb fragments, whispers spread through town. Something had happened in the woods, something unnatural. The local newspaper ran a cautious headline, "Forest Fire Sparks Investigation." But behind closed doors, the FBI was already piecing together the truth. An enemy plane had bombed Oregon. The idea was surreal. How could a Japanese pilot reach Brookings? There were no airfields nearby, no sightings of enemy aircraft, no warning. And yet the evidence was undeniable. The bomb fragments matched Japanese designs. The trajectory pointed to a launch from the sea. The FBI suspected a submarine, but kept the theory classified. Locals were stunned. Some feared invasion, others dismissed it as propaganda. But the fire was real, the smoke was real, and the fear was growing. Schools began practicing air raid drills. Children were taught to hide under desks. Blackout curtains were distributed. Radios buzzed with rumors. One man claimed he saw a plane flying low over the trees. Another swore he heard an explosion. The town was on edge. But there was also resilience. Brookings didn't panic. It adapted. Fire patrols increased. Citizens volunteered for civil defense. The local paper urged calm. We must remain vigilant, but not afraid. The bombing was never officially announced by the government. President Roosevelt feared mass hysteria. The war effort needed unity, not fear. So the incident remained a secret, known only to a few officials and the people of Brookings. For Nobuo Fujita, the silence was deafening. He had dropped his bombs and vanished. He didn't know if the fires had spread. He didn't know if anyone had died. He didn't know that the town he had bombed was now living in quiet fear. Back in Japan, the mission was considered a success. Fujita was praised for his bravery. But he felt no pride. He thought of the forests, the people, the children. He wondered what they had felt when the bombs fell. Years passed. The war escalated. Brookings remained untouched. No further attacks, no invasions. But the memory of that day lingered. The forest fire became a local legend. The pilot became a ghost. And the town waited. Not for revenge, but for answers.
As the war thundered on across Europe and the Pacific, the bombing of Oregon faded into obscurity. It was never broadcast on national radio, no presidential address mentioned it, no war posters bore its name. It became a ghost story, whispered in Brookings, ignored everywhere else. For the U.S. government, the incident was inconvenient. It didn't fit the narrative of American strength. Publicizing it might spark panic or embolden Japan. So it was buried, classified, minimized, forgotten. But for Nobuo Fujita, it was unforgettable. Back in Japan, he resumed his duties. The I-25 continued its patrols, sinking ships and gathering intelligence. Fujita flew more missions, but none as surreal as Oregon. He never saw the aftermath. He never knew the damage. He never heard the voices of the people below. And yet, the memory lingered. He thought of the forests, silent, majestic, vulnerable. He thought of the children in Brookings, practicing air raid drills because of him. He thought of the sword he had carried, the legacy of his ancestors, and wondered if he had honored it or betrayed it. After the war, Japan was devastated. Cities lay in ruins. The emperor had surrendered. Fujita returned to civilian life, working in business and raising a family, but the Oregon mission stayed with him, a quiet ache beneath the surface. He never spoke of it publicly, not until decades later, when a group of American historians began researching the raid. They traced the flight path, examined the bomb fragments, and identified the pilot, Nobuo Fujita. In Brookings, the story resurfaced. Locals remembered the fire, the fear, the silence. But now they wanted something more, understanding. In 1962, the town invited Fujita to visit. It was a bold gesture. He had bombed them. He had been their enemy. But they believed in reconciliation. They believed in peace. Fujita was stunned. He had never imagined returning to the place he had attacked. He feared anger, protest, even arrest. But he accepted. He wanted to see the forest. He wanted to see the people. He wanted to say something he had never said before.
20 years had passed since Nobuo Fujita flew over Oregon. The war was long over. Japan had rebuilt. America had moved on. But the memory of that mission, the bombs, the forest, the silence, still haunted him. He had never spoken publicly about the raid, not in interviews, not to friends, not even to his children. It was a ghost he carried alone, a secret wrapped in honor, duty, and regret. Then, in 1962, something unexpected happened. The town of Brookings, Oregon, the very place he had bombed, invited him to visit. It was part of a cultural exchange program. Local historians had uncovered the story of the bombing and traced it back to Fujita. But instead of anger, they felt curiosity. Instead of vengeance, they offered reconciliation. Fujita was stunned. He had never expected hatred. He feared arrest. He worried that his presence would reopen old wounds. But something inside him stirred, a need to face the past. He accepted the invitation. Before leaving, he made a decision. He would bring his 400-year-old samurai sword, the same one he had carried on the bombing mission. He would offer it to the town as a gesture of peace. His wife asked if he was sure. His children were confused, but Fujita was resolute. If they reject me, I will fall on my sword. He arrived in Brookings in the spring of 1962. The town was quiet, unchanged in many ways. The forests had regrown. The people had aged. But the memory of the bombing still lingered. Fujita stepped off the plane, clutching the sword in cloth. He expected cold stares. He expected protests. Instead, he was met with smiles. The mayor greeted him warmly. Local students presented him with flowers. Veterans shook his hand, reporters snapped photos. And Fujita, the man who had once dropped bombs, bowed deeply. At a small ceremony in the town library, he unwrapped the sword and placed it on the table. He said, "This blade has been in my family for centuries. I brought it with me on the mission, believing I might die. Today, I offer it to you, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of peace." The room was silent, then applause. The sword was accepted and placed in a glass case. A plaque was added. "Gift of Peace, Nobuo Fujita, 1962." Fujita spent several days in Brookings. He visited the bomb site in the forest. He met with school children and answered their questions. He planted a bonsai tree at the library. He spoke of war, regret, and hope. One student asked, "Do you feel guilty?" Fujita paused. After his first visit in 1962, Nobuo Fujita returned to Japan changed. The sword he had once carried into war now rested in a glass case in Brookings. The town he had bombed had embraced him. But he felt there was more to do. Over the next 3 decades, Fujita made several trips back to Brookings. Each time, he was greeted not as a former enemy, but as a friend. He met new generations of students. He walked the forest trails. He stood at the bomb site, now quiet, green, and peaceful. In 1985, he helped fund a student exchange program between Brookings and his hometown of Yeisa, Japan. He believed that young people, not governments, would shape the future. If they know each other, he said, they will never go to war. He planted a peace tree at the bomb site, a Japanese maple, delicate and resilient. It was a living symbol of reconciliation. Locals gathered around as he placed the sapling in the soil. "This tree," he said, "will grow where fire once fell." In 1992, on the 50th anniversary of the bombing, Brookings invited Fujita for a special ceremony. He was now in his 80s, walking slowly but with purpose. Veterans stood beside him, children sang songs of peace. The town presented him with honorary citizenship. Fujita was overwhelmed. He bowed deeply. "I never imagined this," he said. "I came here once as an enemy. Now I am part of your community." He visited the library where his sword still rested. He touched the glass, closed his eyes, and whispered a prayer. He walked to the peace tree, now taller than him, and smiled. Reporters asked why he kept returning. "Because I must," he said. "Because I dropped bombs here, and because you forgave me." His final visit came in 1995. He was frail, but determined. He spoke at a school assembly, telling students about war, honor, and regret. "I was a pilot. I followed orders. But I never forgot what I did, and I never stopped hoping for peace." 2 years later, Nobuo Fujita passed away in Japan. He was 85. Brookings held a memorial service. The town flew its flags at half-mast. Letters poured in from across the country. The man who had once bombed Oregon had become a symbol of healing. His ashes were scattered at the bomb site, among the trees, beside the peace maple, in the soil he had once tried to burn. And the forest remained quiet.
The forest where Nobuo Fujita dropped his bombs is quiet now. The trees have grown tall. The soil is rich. The scars have healed. But the story remains, not as a tale of destruction, but as a testament to redemption. In Brookings, Fujita's name is spoken with reverence. His sword still rests in the town library, encased in glass. The peace tree he planted stands tall, its leaves rustling in the Oregon wind. School children visit the site each year, learning not just about war, but about forgiveness. The bombing of Oregon is still the only aerial attack on the continental United States by a foreign power, but it's remembered not for its damage, which was minimal, but for what came after. Fujita's journey from pilot to peacemaker is taught in classrooms. His story appears in documentaries, history books, and local folklore. Veterans who once fought against Japan now speak of him with admiration. He came back. He didn't have to, but he did. In Japan, Fujita's legacy lives on through his family. His children and grandchildren know the story. They know he carried a sword into war and left it behind in peace. They know he planted trees where he once dropped bombs. The student exchange program he helped create continues. Young people from Brookings and Yazoo visit each other's towns, share meals, attend classes, and build friendships. They walk the forest trails. They visit the sword. They stand beneath the peace tree. And they understand. Fujita's final wish was simple, that no pilot ever again drop bombs on civilians. That his story be remembered not in anger, but in hope. That the forest remain quiet. In 1997, after his death, Brookings held a memorial service. The town flew its flags at half-mast. A plaque was placed at the bomb site. It reads, "From War to Peace, Nobuo Fujita, 1942 to 1997. His ashes were scattered there, among the trees, beside the sword, beneath the sky he once flew through. And the forest remained quiet.